I'm here today, and this actually interview is going to be done with Steve Dinan for Natural Awakening's July issue. And Stephen is the head of the Shift Network. And so, Stephen, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about your background so that people who are not familiar with you can get familiar before we get into the formal interview about your wonderful book.
Great. Well, my original background and training was in science, and I was studying neurobiology and starting to do the research track or maybe go to medical school, but realized at a certain point that it wasn't really revealing the deeper reason for existence, deeper meaning that was possible in life. And so I went more on a spiritual path, a classic growth path. It involved going east to India. It involved deep meditation practice. It involved transpersonal psychology. It involved all kinds of different explorations of consciousness, and eventually led me to the Esalen Institute, where I was working to help to create a think tank on the frontiers of human potential, really, and looking at how do we evolve different fields. And while I was there, I sat a meditation retreat. I actually had sat a number of them in the past, but I got a pretty big download that there needed to be a large company that would be sharing the kind of material that was available at Esalen with everybody at their fingertips and in small towns around the world, and essentially creating this web work of new consciousness that would be helping to shift things towards a new era. And at the time, I didn't have a background in business, no background in media. It was a big vision, and frankly, took a long time to unfold. I first tried to launch it as a startup right before the first dot-com bubble burst, and so I made some headway, but ran up some debt and needed to kind of like reboot and learn more and build networks. Eventually launched a prototype for the Shift Network under the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is a frontier think tank focusing on science and spirituality. And it was created by astronaut Edgar Mitchell. And then eventually I had to let that go as well, even though it was reasonably successful. And finally, 2010, 10 years after I got the original download, I started the company again, and since have been able to grow it into at least the beginning of what that original download vision showed me was mine to create in this lifetime. So, now we've had 2.5 million people participate in things. We've worked with 1,500 teachers in different domains. We've created hundreds of different courses and trainings and summits, really looking at all different, harvesting the world's wisdom about how do we grow and evolve to the next level, psychologically, spiritually, how do we fulfill more of our human potential and translate that into an up-leveled world. So that's sort of the bigger picture of the Shift Network. And then within the context of that, I also realized that I have a core passion around shifting society, not just the individual. And so that's harder to build a business around, but I wrote a book called Sacred America, Sacred World about how America could fill its higher potential and promise in a parallel way that an individual matures to his or her next level of development. That I believe America has a next level of expression that we can find, but it requires us doing some internal house cleaning, clearing out the past, letting go of different political polarizations, being more solution focused, more focused on fulfilling a larger mission, which I see ultimately as one in service to the globe, rather than just in service to ourselves. So I think that America can do that. When I wrote the book in 2015 and went on the tour in 2016, I was more optimistic that was on the horizon. We were now going through what I would consider something of a death rebirth cycle, where with the coronavirus is exposing some of the fault lines in our politics, fault lines in the way we take care of people, the way we do healthcare, the way our economy. So all of the problems, if you will, with the previous version of our democracy are getting exposed in a very painful way. Yes. And I think out of the ashes of that, there can be, and I hope will be, a reemergence of a more nobly motivated, more conscious, more whole, less corrupt version of our democracy. Because I think that's ultimately what we're all here to do. We're here to create a shift to a new pattern of civilization that is more healthy, that's more whole, that's based on a sacred reverence for life and each other, and that is reflected in institutions that are well designed and that help us to create a peaceful and sustainable civilization, and that we draw from all of the wisdom pioneers who have gone before us and how to do that, whether those are Zen teachers to shamans to Christian mystics to psychologists. There's a lot of people with a lot of good wisdom about how do we live in a more conscious and whole way. And our job at the Shift Network is to share as many of those as we can, those perspectives we can, and help people to have that wisdom available so they can grow in their own lives.
Your book is literally, I think, a map. So if this is for some people, this is a new territory. I would say for some who you reference Paul Ray and his book, Cultural Creatives. And he recognized what was, I think, something like 30 million people way back when he wrote his book that were on this path. And so I like how you weave the conservatives and the progressives and the spiritual and, the political. You really cover everything in this book. And it seems to me that if anybody had that and they read it together as maybe a book study, that people could get ideas in their community and go off and start on a local basis. The thing that I really loved, and there's an old expression, I think might be a proverb, something like, without a vision, the people perish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I forget the exact quote, but I know that one. Yeah,
something like that.
Where there is no vision, the people perish. The people will perish, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was Marianne Williamson who says she quotes someone in the very beginning. It says, you can live your life out of circumstances, or you can live your life out of a vision. And I don't know how much of that is known to the people. We don't seem to have a collective vision in our country that we can unite behind, which is why I thought your book was so interesting and compelling, because it provides the vision, a beautiful vision, which I'm hoping you'll share, not to give it all away, but to share some of what that vision is in this interview and titillate people's curiosity so they buy the book and read the whole vision for themselves. So it's very comprehensive, and it's laid out so beautifully in an order. And it's got the deep wisdom of it that you build on from the history onto the present and bring in, like the indigenous people, why we need to bring that element in. So why don't you tell us what your vision for a sacred America actually is?
Well, in my worldview, living in a sacred way means living in reverence for all of humanity and all of life, that we see the divinity in all people and all things. We don't just see that in a few people or in a tribe or a group or a political party, that we really see that there is a higher, nobler, deeper dimension to all of manifest reality, and which is expressed in humans' spiritual and religious impulse over time. And great mystics see this kind of deep interconnectedness of being, that we are kind of in a way, all fabric, part of the one fabric that unites us. And that, Edgar Mitchell, on his way back from the moon, the founder of the Institute of Noetic Science, had what he called a noetic experience in space, seeing the planet as a whole and having a spiritual awakening to the great interconnectedness and the preciousness of this little planet we've been given. That really is, there's a deeper truth. It's kind of like a higher vantage point for how we see life. And out of that flows a different way of engaging each other and designing how life works here. Now, what we typically have is we have a lot of forces pulling us into our separation, whether that's our identity as Americans, our identity as Democrats or Republicans, our identity as countercultural versus mainstream culture. You see these bifurcations happen all the time, and that what we become is we identify with part of reality and then make the rest of reality wrong, bad, problematic in some way. And I think those things are always going to keep us in a state of suffering to some level. Mm. So a sacred America is not ultimately just about America. It's really about recognizing our role within the larger whole. That's why it's Sacred America's Sacred World. It's not just nationalistic. It's really about our unity as one human family. And when we can redesign our society from that standpoint, we're actually fulfilling the deepest principles on which this country was based. You know, e pluribus unum, I have a whole chapter on that.
Yes.
It's a deep metaphysical concept, out of many one. And so you're not saying it's all is oneness, it's like out of many one. So we're evolving from our manyness into our oneness, and they each have their role. Our manyness gives us individuality. It's the unique flavors of life, different cultures, languages. We don't want to erase all that and it's just all one big mush. But if we don't remember that we have this unitive ground and vision that unites us, we end up in kind of bitter partisanship and fighting with each other in a way that doesn't actually befit who we are. I think that you know, part of the fulfillment of a sacred vision for our country is actually building upon our most ancient principles. You know, liberty, equality, and justice for all. I think those three things together offer a kind of a powerful triumvirate. If you just focus on liberty and freedom, you can get, oh, liberty and my liberty, and you can end up squashing other people or harming other people because your liberty is supposed to trump everybody else's. But when you balance liberty, which is an important value and virtue, with equality, which is another important value and virtue is baked in, with justice for all, that actually starts to create a balanced society where we're saying, yes, your liberty, but you have to balance that because you can't just run over other people's rights or harm them in other ways. You're not free to harm as you wish. You have to treat people with equal rights as well. You can't just exploit people because you feel like it. So the liberty, equality, and justice for all, those are deep principles that are baked into our democracy and our national you know, soul, if you will. And so what we're really talking about is not so much recreating things as fulfilling that which is already within us. It's like we have the acorns, or the acorn of America was planted back in 1776, or probably further back, because there were roots of it that came out of Europe, and there were roots of it that came out of Native American culture as well. A lot of times those are neglected, and it's an important part of, I think, the healthy maturation of our democracy that we reclaim those indigenous roots and heal those wounds, acknowledge the genocide that happened with the Native American peoples, and that needs to be rectified, so that, not just rectified because it's a problem to be fixed, but it's a barrier to us fulfilling our mission. Because the Native peoples had essential wisdom that the Europeans didn't have. They had a kind of a deep reverence for the planet and for nature that had kind of gotten, you know, purged out of the Europeans to some extent. There was a deep respect for life and for tribe, and there's a way in which some of the natural rhythms of different Native peoples had a deep wisdom. And in fact, a lot of the founding codes for our democracy came out of the Iroquois Confederation, which is a very well-designed system that had checks and balances, that had peaceful principles baked into it. There was actually even one of the elements, I think, that we lost and could have really kept was the fact that the women, they had a male council that were making decisions, but they had a female council that would keep those boys in check. So basically, if the guys got out of hand, the women could say, "Oh, let's pull the plug on their power," which actually has really deep wisdom in it, because part of what I think fulfills America's promise is a balance, or a sacred exchange, if you will, between masculine and feminine, between male and female. And that's part of where we've gotten off kilter. We've gotten overly masculinized. We're tough, rugged individualists, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you know, it's like the fighter impulse, and there's a warrior kind of energy, and there's virtue in that. But when it's out of balance with the more feminine values of care for the whole and nurturance and respecting the sacred web of life, that's when we start getting full of ourselves and arrogant in a way that doesn't actually serve. So we need to bring the feminine back into balance. It's part of why I really, I get behind a lot of women who are running for office. I was just talking with a woman, Betsy Sweet, who is very actually inspired by the book and has putting those principles. She's running for Senate in Maine right now. So she really, I think, is a great embodiment of exactly what I'm talking about in this book, is a different kind of leadership. We're seeing it more globally in places like, I think New Zealand with the Jacinda Ardern is, I think, embodying that next level of conscious political leadership that we need. And it is about this restoration of balance between the masculine and feminine qualities in our consciousness, and then building those principles into our democracy. And so there's a lot
I
of different
like that
layers of
the
it, but
one.
I think we have to kind of dig deep into the roots, realize the sacred inheritance of what we've been given, which is in some ways been a more conservative project. Like conservatives in general, our society have more reverence for our roots, for the Constitution,
Yeah,
for founding principles. And progressives are always busy trying to change things.
yeah.
And we focus more on what's the future and what's not working yet. But there's actually, they're complementary, is that we want to build upon and honor the foundations that we created, and we want to say, yes, we can go further. Yes, we can embody this principle more. We can create a more just, more equal, more free society every year.
I like that you bring up a couple of times that America is really an adolescent nation. We're not that old in the context of considering all the other continents, countries, nations. And I also like that you bring up that we need to acknowledge the shadow part of ourselves and integrate that in, which is part of what you're talking about for the indigenous people, and the slavery that you talk about for rectifying. So I really was kind of curious now, do you think that possibly the pandemic that we have with coronavirus, do you think it sidetracked any of the momentum we might have been building at all around
Well,
moving towards a sacred America, sacred
you
world?
know, I think that our natural impulse is to want to see ever onward, ever upward. And I think
Of
the
course.
truth is a lot of times, I had an Aikido teacher once who said, I feel pretty good about myself. She said, I've become a 1x4 person. And I was like, what does
What's
that mean, a
that?
1x4? And she says, you know how life is. You get a little nudge, you get a little whack, then you get and then you get a 1x4, then you get a 2x4, then you get a brick wall. She's like, I moved from being a 2x4 person to getting a 1x4. So, I think it was a funny way to say that. It's like, if we need a wake up call, it's going to come in some form. Now, it's not as simple to say like we got coronavirus because we needed a wake up call, but
Right.
it's like what coronavirus is doing is actually exposing the ways that we need to grow as a country. And it's exposing the fault lines in the form of it's a pretty brutal process. And so like an addict hitting bottom, sometimes you need to really experience the brokenness of something before the new emerges. There's a kind of a shedding of the hubris and the sort of, oh, I can handle this. And like there's certain aspects that are more like we've been addicted to a certain vision of ourselves. It's like tough and powerful and we're rich and we can do all this and we're exceptional. And we're getting humbled right now. It's like we have the worst outbreak in the world. We've handled it exceptionally poorly. I've seen pieces from Ireland and elsewhere that are just like, this is the first time when the world is pitying the United States. And I think that actually has the potential to create more spiritual growth for us in the long term than simply just getting stronger, bigger every year, right? And so I think that what we're experiencing is a kind of it's like a dark night of the country right now. And that dark night of the country, if we navigate it well, leads to a kind of a spiritual rebirth. It could happen this year. It could take longer. But my sense is that 2020 wants to be this kind of like rubbling of an old pattern, and that if we're smart and wise, we move forward and we say, what do we need to do differently, and how do we need to rewire our society? Not just go back to the old pattern, but like that we need a really fundamentally new pattern. How can we redesign healthcare so we don't have so many people falling through the cracks? How do we redesign our economy so it works for a greater number of people? How do we redesign our politics so it's not corrupted by those things? And those are topics that I cover in the book. But it's not just like I'm the only one with solutions or something, which would be crazy. It's like really it's a collective project of exploring what are the contours of this new vision, this upgraded America, or in the book I call it America 7.0, because I make the case that there's been these different arcs of development, and oftentimes we go through a little crash before we, it's like we were addicted to slavery, and then we had to go through the crash of the Civil War and coming out the other side of that before we could be like, okay, we got to drop that whole slavery thing and move on to where we're actually embodying equality in a deeper way, which is baked into our principles. And so now we're actually having to redesign a society that really takes care of everyone, or that creates an opportunity and doesn't just cast people off or say, well, forget about them. They're old, they're sick, let them die. Like we're not going to come out of this with that mentality anymore.
No, I agree. And I liked a lot of the things that you integrated into your plan around education, that our kids aren't really the emotional aspect. A lot of things are missed. I mean, it's not just about book learning, and those other types of learning serve children longer into their adult life than, I'm not saying math isn't good, but I think
No,
to balance a checkbook, yes, but they really need, our kids need emotional stability and strengthening our families. You talk about that in the book, and like I said, I just really feel that that is a very comprehensive plan. And that, if have you done anything on the Shift Network with that? Because if you did, I missed it.
So there's different phases of shift that in terms of our growth is like right now we're primarily serving an older adult audience because, and frankly, most of the people who are kind of in the trenches raising families, it's like they don't necessarily have as much time to devote to the personal growth, to new
Yeah.
explorations. And so it's been an older and more female audience that we first attracted. Now our game plan is to expand to include a much wider audience, but I do feel like in the larger scheme of things, the women are feeling called to this empowerment in some ways faster and more than men. And that's because I think of this rebalancing of the society. There's also been a way that we've been very ageist as a society and often neglected the wisdom elder voices in our society and privileged the youth voices. And so I think part of the rebalancing is also to kind of revalidate the elders, if you will. And so we often have more of the kind of the most respected elder teachers, not necessarily the hip, cool young teacher, right? So, and I think that that's by design, that's part of the rebalancing that's required. So I do think that families and education systems are all going to be going through their own upgrade. I wouldn't call my book comprehensive. It's more of like a kind of like a broad picture of like, what are some of the key pivots that are happening in each domain and that need to happen? And it's like each one of those, you can do 100 books just on how the education system needs to evolve. But I'm just pointing to some of the broad patterns because I think what's useful, the reason that's useful for people is to see the forest.
Yes.
Most of the time we spend so much in the trees. It's like we got to deal with like, getting the kids off to school or handling the next project at launch at work. And because we're not having a wide enough vision of the whole, like the astronauts got coming back. It's like, wow, it's like
Yes.
you see our planet and our civilization in a different way when you see it from the outside. It's called the overview effect. So this book isn't, giving you a view from space, but it is giving you kind of like a little more of like a 35,000 foot view of how America is itself on its own growth trajectory. We've gone through different cycles. We've had some death rebirths. We've had some near misses. We've had some places where we really, didn't fulfill our founding principles or a deeper DNA. And then we had to get course correct. And we're having to course correct right now. And it's a painful process. And we don't know exactly how long it's going to take, but I feel like our job as people committed to that growth and evolution is to do the best we can to evolve ourselves and to be champions of what needs to evolve in our society and to hold that vision. Because without the vision, we tend to regress back to the more self-interested short term. And self-interested short-term behavior is what's leading to so many of the problems rather than long-term, deeply caring decisions that aren't just for us, but really for the next generations, the legacy that we leave.
Well, the adolescence kind of explains that,
right, which is a time of short-term gratification, right?
Yes.
It wasn't just my idea to do that. It's like there was, I think it was Dwayne Elgin who would go and give talks, and he would ask every audience that he said, if we were a civilization, and in the growth, like what age would we be? And pretty much every audience was like late adolescent. Late adolescent, we're a little full of ourselves. We're not thinking long term. We're making some stupid decisions that could poison our future, like undermining the climate. As an example, I know Natural Awakening's very committed to living in a more natural, symbiotic way with the environment, and we're acting like adolescents. We're using up resources. We're over consuming. We're thinking about our short-term gratification rather than our long-term sustainability. And so that's an adolescent psychology. And there's other ways that we're adolescent as well. Like we're kind of like enamored of like status and fame and, some of the, sort of early things rather than like the wisdom voice is one that's like, what's for the good of the tribe? What is gonna be something that endures for the next generation? How do we care for everyone? That's a mature adult conversation, and the center of gravity of our most of our conversation is more short-term gratification adolescent. And it's not to make it wrong, but it is to say, okay, it's time to grow up to
it's
the
time
next
to
level.
grow up.
Exactly.
I want the one thing that I want to bring this to a conclusion. This is an all hands on deck issue. As you point out, everybody needs to contribute something to this new vision. We all need to be involved. This is not sit on your sofa and watch somebody else do something, but to, like I said, all hands on deck and get in there and work at it in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one thing that's particularly important is that we really see that that's both left and right, conservative, progressive, Democrat, Republican, libertarian, whatever it is. There's each faction of society has its gift to this larger whole, which is part of why when I wrote the book, I knew I'm a progressive by temperament.
Yeah.
I had various conservatives critique it, and I changed things in the book so that I had many people say like, oh, this is actually a book that my Republican brother and I actually read and felt aligned with. So I wanted to write something that it was about a deeper level of things. It wasn't just about the polarization of the day, but that actually we actually have a shared desire and shared impulse that is deeper than just the political polarization. And that each wing of things in the US can bring their gifts into. And I think that's part of what we're going to have to see. The extreme partisanship is going to go through a death, and there's going to be I think a more enlightened version of the Democrats and a more enlightened version of the Republicans that come on board. Might have different names. You don't even know. It's like with what's going on, and maybe there's a whole death rebirth of the Republican Party that turns into a new form. But there's still always going to have this tilt of more conservative orientation to the more kind of progressive orientation. And I think if they work together, there's a Republican that I really like, and Bill Shireman, and he says, the American eagle has two wings, the
Yes.
progressive wing and the conservative wing, and it needs both to fly. And I think that's when we really soar as a country, when we can get to that place of deep, respectful honoring of differences and a recognition of the complementarity of the different things we bring, rather than just trying to just like overwhelm, denigrate, and basically destroy the opposition.
Well, a lot of people spend a lot of time complaining or talking about what's wrong. And I think that this book, when you have a vision and you can start talking about what you can do and questioning and focusing on that, on what we can have, how the world can be, that takes away that negative energy of that complaining and the focused on what's wrong. We all know what's wrong, but to find the solutions. I've been participating in Bruce Lipton, who you've had on the Shift Network. He's proposed that everybody 5 minutes at 11 o'clock in the morning and 5 minutes at 11 o'clock in the night, if you're still awake, spending time envisioning the world as you would like it to be, a more peaceful, as Charles Einstein says, to imagining the more beautiful world that can be. So I just think that it may not, your book, when you say it's not comprehensive, it doesn't give the answers, but what I like is that it's provocative. It makes people think about, well, what can we do? I mean, here's this idea, you've sort of, set a bell off in somebody's head, and now you can have a conversation. Oh, I read this in Steve's book, and let's talk about this.
Yeah. So one thing, like Betsy Sweet, who I just talked to this week, and who's running for Senate in Maine, you were talking about the idea of her having a whole series of town halls.
Yes.
Around each area of the society, and what's the vision for that area? How could Maine lead the way? You can do it on the local level. You can do, like, we've had this conversation with our local mayor in Nevada City, California, which is like, how can Nevada City be an embodiment of the future that we want to see? How can we create more visionary collaboration on activating that next level? So it can be on a small town level, it can be on a state level, it can be on a national level, and ultimately we start with our individual transformation, and we end up
Yeah.
with something that where our whole planet really fulfills its mission. So I don't think we should ever, when I was in my 20s, I wasn't really doing a lot of this thing. I was just curious about my growth, and I was going to meditation retreats and exploring this and that. And out of that whole deeper exploration of my own potential emerged a deeper vision for our social potential and ultimately our global potential. So I think we'd never underestimate the importance of our own journey of growth and going beyond some of the frameworks we've inherited, and then sharing that in circles and sharing that with other people, starting to infuse it into businesses, into churches, into magazines. And those little seeds that get planted. I wrote the book 4 years ago, and Betsy said she's been using it, is referring to it while she's running for Senate in Maine. And I was like, well, that's how beautiful. Like a little seed, little Johnny Appleseed planted something 4 years ago, and it's like bearing some fruit now. And each of us don't know where the little seeds that we plant are going to ultimately turn into something that really flowers and benefits the world.
Well, I'm going to suggest to our local Pachamama Alliance group that we each buy the book, so that we're actually developing a vision for a center to teach people about resiliency, regenerative agriculture, all the good things that are in your book, actually. So it'll be a great place for us to start. I'm so glad that Natural Awakenings gave me this assignment. It was just what I needed at the right time.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for devoting your life to really natural awakenings of people and the planet.
Yeah. Namaste, Stephen.
Namaste.
Thank you.